Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us once again. I have the pleasure of sharing the space with Mr. Laurence Westgaph again, he's a local historian, specialises in Liverpool and the slave trade, and is currently working towards a PhD as well, that's right. And we're following on from the last conversation we have had. The theme of the questions tonight is I'm going to be inquiring particularly about our relationship in that area as it pertains to America, because every time I listen to you speak, I realize the bonds that we had with America are a lot stronger than I thought. We were much more involved deeply. We can't be like, oh, that's an American thing. That we were deep in, and the Caribbean a little bit as well. But I first wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, a non-historical question. And it's just, as a man who reads, as a man who thinks, as a human being, this question of shame. So I read the comments, overwhelmingly positive. And I saw, like in your individual Facebook Liverpool and Slavery group, overwhelmingly positive. But every once in a while, you see something and you think, where's that coming from? I noticed there's a degree of defensiveness and sort of, it seems to be like this idea that you're attacking my team. How much of that do you think is unmerited shame? Like people are ashamed, but they shouldn't feel ashamed. How much do you think that's a factor?
I think all of it's unmerited shame.
Right.
I can say that without any equivocation.
So just to be clear, the motivation for saying, well, let's talk about the Muslims, or let's talk about the so-and-so slave trade,
the whataboutery.
The whataboutery is shame rooted, but your position would be what shame like? Do you not ascribe any shame to a group? Do you not think I should be ashamed for being white?
No, of course not.
I wish I could have said it with a straight face.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. Nobody's responsible for the actions of people who preceded them, are they? Right. And in saying that, most people who live today, they may benefit from the structures that were put in place during that period in the present day, but they weren't responsible for creating it.
Right.
So it's worth acknowledging it and being aware of it, but I don't think anyone should feel guilty about it. What I would like to see is people collectively come together to kind of do away with the legacies of this particular part of history. And that's a collective effort that needs to be done collectively. And I think the world would be a better place if we were able to approach this subject openly and honestly and then do something about the legacies of it, instead of being like that you're insulting me because you're highlighting a part of history that I don't want to hear about. Yeah. That's where I think the real issue comes from.
What I think I heard you just say is we should do it collectively, meaning free from notions of race. We should do it collectively as human beings.
Absolutely.
So I like torturing myself with difficult questions. I have my ex-girlfriend was Bosnian and spent a lot of time in Sarajevo. I'm clued up about what happened in Bosnia. I don't blame at all young Serbs or even Serbs who were alive at the time for what happened. I would find that obscene. And then I took it out and I was like, well, if you look at the massacres in Rwanda, would you say to a random person, no? And then I started wondering, where's the boundaries on this? Like where, I mean, you're a historian, not a psychologist. Neither of us are philosophers, but where should someone feel shame? Should Germans who are still alive, who were serving Nazis, should they feel shame?
Well, if you were actively involved and engaging in some sort of form of persecution, then you should certainly be aware of your actions and, if possible, do something to kind of, to make good for what, you actually did. Yeah. But when you're born into a system that was in place before you were even thought about and maybe multi-generational, how can you take any type of ownership for those events in history that created the situation that you're in? I don't think you can. But what we can do collectively, as other people have done in previous generations, if you think like the civil rights movement, is we can collectively get together to address some of the inequalities that were created through these events in history. That's where I think the responsibility is on all of us. Yeah. We should all be willing to kind of try and make the world a better place because it benefits us all.
So I'm trying to apply psychological procedures to history here. I'm doing it optimistically, a little bit naively. So what I think I heard you say is maybe in order to engage in that process, I think I heard you say like the idea of collective shame probably isn't particularly useful. It's not functional, is it? So if we were going to try and do something now about the problems of today, that would need to be explicitly dropped first.
Oh, the idea of shame, yeah. But
collective shame.
But I think you've got to be willing to talk about the history in order to get there.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's that open and honest discussion.
Yeah.
And people come to the table at different levels of involvement, of evolution. So some of it is an educational process, and then something is based on the education or the information that you've received, acting upon that. And that's how you deal with some of the inequalities that have been created over the generations. I don't think we've done that openly, and it's a lot to do with the way we're educated.
Yeah,
this idea of we only talk about the good bits of history or the things that make the British look good, when we need to be far more open and understand the processes that were in place that made us one of the the richest nations on the earth. There's a lot of terrible history that goes along with that.
Yeah.
But it's our inability to kind of face that. I think that caused a lot of the problems around this collective shame, and the responses that you see in the comments, for example, is that being articulated.
To the point about history, do you know who decides what history we cover? Is it
some of it is politicians, isn't it?
Right,
and then the people who they put in place to kind of shape the curriculum.
Yeah.
So much of it is traditional now as well. People do it unthinkingly. This is what you need to learn. Yeah. And there's so much more to that. So I think it's academics and as well in many cases, educationalists.
Yeah.
So they're the people that you've got to talk to, but it's how you talk to them and what type of conversations you actually have about maybe addressing the need for a rethinking of the syllabus.
Sorry to hammer the point. It's for you get all kinds of people watching. If you say Liverpool had a hand in the slave trade and slaves were bought and sold in Liverpool, you're not saying Liverpool's a shit city and Scousers are scumbags.
Exactly.
That's not a synonymous statement.
That's it. That's exactly.
Because you're proud of your city.
I'm very proud of my city.
Proud to be
I wouldn't be the person that I am if I wasn't a part of this. If my family hadn't come to this city, I'm very aware of that.
Yeah.
And by talking about the city's complex history, I don't think I'm doing the city down. That's a lot of, again, I think I might have mentioned this to you before. I think a lot of people approach history the way they approach the favourite football team. Yeah. I'm a blue nose. No one can tell me Everton are not the best team in the world.
Yeah.
But I know that that's not factually true. Right. Do you know what I mean?
It's a religious conviction.
It's more exactly, and I think a lot of people think about their history, their city and its history in that same kind of fashion. We support the city's history the way we support our favourite football team.
Yes. Which is, it's a little bit infantile, really.
Of course it is. Yeah.
Because the way I look at it is I just go, well, yeah, I'm from here. I have an emotional attachment to the world, an emotional attachment to Liverpool and the culture here. I just find it fascinating, and I don't see it as how can you condemn? I mean, obviously, some of the actions are morally reprehensible. They are condemnable, but you can't condemn a city. You can't condemn a place or
an inanimate object. Do you know what I mean? Totally. I mean, it's nationalism, though, isn't it? Nationalism creates a lot of irrational thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? From that flag waving, no, this flag is unsullied.
Yeah.
To the terrible actions that are done under that flag. Whether it's at home or abroad. Yeah. And it's about challenging that. It's about asking people, well, what does it mean to consider yourself to be a proud nationalist? You can still be proud of your country and acknowledge its full history. I don't see a contradiction in that.
I don't.
And
I can hold all that inside my head.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad that you started with the local, because I used the Liverpool. I used Liverpool's local history to tell this more global history. And that's the story of nations, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So, you take it that further bit out from Liverpool, you can talk about Britain. We're talking about in relation to America. These are the United States. These are places that have very strong national stories and histories and identities based on those. Yeah. But when you go and examine them and scrutinize them a bit a bit more deeply, you find all these other stories which are just as important as this main narrative that has been pulled out because it makes us all look great, but have been forgotten about because it gives us a different nuance to the history of the country, the city, the place, wherever it may be. And that's something that I'm really interested in kind of trying to, pull out of these more bland kind of narrative, national narratives that we have.
Yeah. They're simplistic.
Very simplistic.
And in a sense, a little bit patronizing and dehumanizing. I wonder if as a historian, or maybe this is true of all historians, like you can't really avoid the psychology.
No.
Because everything gets kind of spun. Even if you think you're being neutral, there's always going to be...
Well, I think that's definitely why we teach history the way that we teach it, because we want people to think in a certain way.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
There's a foregone conclusion that we're sort of leading you to, and here's the sales pitch.
Absolutely, 100%. And people, if they know their history, they will behave in a certain way because they know their history. So it's very easy to get people to go and fight wars against other nations if you've told them that your nation, based on its great history, is better than another nation. So it's a tool that's used to kind of socially control people. That's what fascinates me about history, because you don't necessarily see it just by looking at the subject, but when you see how history has been used by different nations, you can kind of pull that out from this more bland story of the history of the country.
The final question I have for you on shame specifically was, just to be clear, we're assuming that at some level, and it must be somewhere where there's an intersection between politics and history, there are people in rooms making a decision based on what history to tell, and shame must be a factor in that. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I would suggest that the stories that are told is because people don't want these more shameful stories being known by the general populace.
And to be clear, neither of us think that there should be shame about.
No, not at all. It's history.
It is what it is.
It's a discipline. It's like if we were talking about a science and you didn't tell people about the elemental table or something, you're missing out a massively important part of the subject.
Yeah.
And people won't be able to get a good understanding if you're not willing to tell them about these elements.
Because your feelings are getting hurt.
Or because you want to control people, or you don't want them to think, in a certain way. I see it a lot. It's really easy to articulate in the case of the United States, for example. So Americans have a very definite idea of what it means to be an American, and usually that's a white American who doesn't have any connection to these other countries apart from, or continents apart from Europe, somewhere down the, somewhere 250 years ago. But up until the 1820s, the majority of people who lived in the United States were black.
Sorry.
Yeah. So up until about the 1820s, the majority of people who lived in the United States were black people. The mass migration of Europeans to the Americas begins really in post the 1820s.
When you say the, you've caught me with a bit of a sucker punch there, Laurence. So when you say the majority, what sort, do you know what sort of proportion it would have been?
Well, you'd have to check out the census figures, which I'm not sure if
but
they have. But they're mainly enslaved people, and they were black because most of the people, most people don't want to leave their homes. Do you know what I mean? Most people want to stay in Europe and have a decent life there. They don't want to go across to a foreign country in another part of the world and start out again. So it was only when America really started to become a very prosperous place that white people started to go out there en masse. So the people before then, it was mainly forced migration of people of African descent.
So I have to apologize for people watching. I'm a bit staggered by that. So does that mean that America before the 1820s was mainly plantations and farms with forced labor, and that was all that was going on there?
Yeah.
The 1820s is quite recent.
Very recent, 200 years ago. That's how recent it is. But don't forget, again, this is what I'm saying about like the national narrative in the United States. That's why it is so drummed into the people, the people all that pledging allegiance and all that, because it's a very young nation. We don't flag wave like the American, people from the United States flag wave, do they? Because we've got this much longer, nuanced history where we don't really have this belief in British exceptionalism the way Americans have this idea that of American exceptionalism, which is done specifically to give people a feeling of belonging. But because of their terrible history of race, as well as saying to one group of Americans who were born on the soil and have been there, since it became a nation, you belong. They're also able to say, and you don't belong to another group of people who in some cases have been there far longer than those European communities.
I'm reiterating for my own good and for people listening, what you would be saying would be to use the social constructs of black and white to keep it a little bit simpler, which we said we shouldn't be trying to give it too simple. Okay, let's say African and European. The African population is the majority, and they have physically been on that soil for longer, verifiably, than the Europeans who come.
Europeans had been there, and they were the ones who brought them, but not in the numbers. They were the Europeans who brought them or who bought them
numbers.
Were in smaller numbers, kind of like what you saw in the Caribbean and stuff.
I learned. You told me to read the diary of Thomas Thistlewood, and when I was reading around it last night, it said that the ratio would be 1 white European to 20 normally black Africans there, and maybe that contributed to the violence and the fear and whatever.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
It wasn't quite that same situation in America, but the African population was the majority and had been there for longer than the majority of whites who came over.
And that's still the case, because there was laws that were passed to limit migration from, or immigration from black countries, as you would call them. Again, that's a silly word. Whereas there weren't any for European countries, certainly not from Northern European countries.
You always say stuff, and then when I watch the interview backwards, I'm like, why didn't you ask about that? Sorry, who said? So, are you saying that there were laws that stopped emigration from African countries, but European,
from any countries, even Southern Europeans? So at one stage, they wouldn't let Italians and Iberians, and this were all this races shaped America in so many different ways. So. Those people who we now consider to be white, like Italians or people from Spain, they weren't considered, or people from the Iberian Peninsula, they weren't considered to be white at one stage. It was only Northern Europeans, and they were put into this grade of race where, like I talked about on the tour about polygenism, they were put into a separate grade of the human race, with black people at the bottom. Southern Europeans were somewhere in between. They weren't as high as Northern Europeans. This was very much part of America's development during that period and its ideas around racial laws. But because of that, they had, they forbade immigration from black countries, so from Africa or the Caribbean.
The Americans said you cannot immigrate.
Yeah, you cannot immigrate to the United States if you are a Negro, basically.
If you're free, you can't come here. But if you're kidnapped and
this
chained,
this is later. So this is after the colonial period. This is right up until the 20th century. I think 1925 was like.
And then they said if you're from Uganda, you can come.
Well, yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
So what was the reasoning? Was it to keep a black population small?
You've got a society that's codified race. Yeah, it's legally codified. Okay, which goes back to when it was colonies. So the British codified race in what became the United States.
Yeah,
and that remained in place right into the 20th century. That idea that we don't want black people here. You're only here. We'd like to deport you. Do you know what I mean? Even Lincoln, when we talk about Lincoln, the great emancipator, he wanted to deport all the blacks.
Where did he
send them to Haiti?
Really?
Yeah. He was looking at. These are some of the things he was looking into to kind of deal with the race problem.
That sounds like the Germans with the Jews.
Well, there you go.
Where do we deport them to?
Yeah. So he wanted to get. He looked into deporting all the blacks to Haiti. This was very much the way people were thinking during that time, and that's why I say to you, like, if you know the history of the United States, you can understand why racism so viscerally expresses itself over there even to this day. It's in the bones, the DNA of the country.
Yeah. And as we've already said, it's a social construct. So you have basically a deception in the bones of it. I mean, that... better be careful what I say about America. From a psychological point of view, if that was a family unit, you would say, one might say, unless you resolve that, you'll never know peace. you'll never have peace.
Look, we're more than a half a century since the civil rights movement, and you still see, the crazy disparities in that country, still dealing with its long history of slavery and, racism, Jim Crow, all that comes out of that.
You used the term Jim Crow last time, and I know the context in which it's used. And so I nodded sagely and I was like, yes, it's some sort of race rule, black officers in the army can't drink with white officers and so on. When I looked it up, is Jim Crow an official name for the rules?
No, not really. Because it just covers everything that they kind of did to kind of...
I'm sure I've heard them say it in their Houses of Parliament, whatever that is.
Oh, they may well have talked about it.
But they say Jim Crow.
Yeah, they
which is technically it's a racist term, right?
Well,
jumping Jim Crow is a blackface,
like minstrels and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is, but it's just part of their history, and that's how they talk about it. Just think about this: when a young black girl, went to a school, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of people standing outside to stop her from being able to go into that school. That's,
where would scenes like that take place? Down in the South, Alabama?
Well, primarily in the South, but not only in the South. Do you know what I mean?
Because they didn't want black people getting an education.
But didn't want black children fraternizing with white children. Do you know what I mean? That says it all, doesn't it? You're taught to dislike people based on their physical appearance or their race. And yet there you are, an opportunity to kind of start to break down those barriers. And adults are like, no, I don't want my child going to school with a black kid.
With that one, I always, again, got to be so careful. I always wonder if you got the country DNA tested, you might find, because of the kind of population movements you're talking about, people are blacker than they think they are.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, how many pure whites?
There's no such thing.
I mean, they'll have Native American blood in them. They'll have black blood. They have. It's so unlikely that they don't.
Almost all black people have white blood in them in the United States, even in light of all the rules against segregation and miscegenation.
Yes.
So it's inevitable that a significant population of whites will also see the same. But see, this is the idea, isn't it? In America, although it wasn't legally codified in most states, they did have things like the one drop rule.
What's the one drop?
So, okay, so in Jamaica, I think I might have told you about this on the walk. In Jamaica, in the British colonies, we graded race down to the 32nd degree. So if you were a 32nd black, then you were black.
In England, we said that.
In the Caribbean.
Oh, in the Caribbean, right.
So there was terminology. So that's where words like half caste and all that type of stuff come from. So
I'm a bit thick when it comes to maths. If it's 32nd, are you saying that's
a great?
Really?
Yeah. So if you were
great.
Do you want me to break it down for you?
Please.
Okay. So
as I'm a bright 16-year-old,
okay.
But 16 like secondary school language.
Okay. So in 1760 there was a rebellion in Jamaica called Takys Rebellion, and off the back of that there was a lot of draconian laws put in place to stop people of colour from being able to do certain things on the island. This was all based on your racial makeup. So in Jamaica, they based people's blackness on, they gave it different grades. So if both your parents were full Africans, Negroes, you were a Negro. Then if you were 75% black, which was a full Negro parent and a mulatto parent, you were called a Sambo. Then if you were 50% black, this was proper terminology. So you were 50% black, you were a mulatto.
Okay.
Then if you were a quarter black, 25% black, you were known as a quadroon, so a quarter. Then if you were an eighth black, you were an octoroon. Then if you were a 16th black, you were either known as a musty or a hexdecaroon. And then if you were a 32nd black, you were a mustafino. And only when a Mustafino had a baby with a white person was that child considered to be white. If you were any of those grades, you could be legally a slave, and you couldn't inherit. You couldn't join any of the professions on the island. You couldn't join the Jamaica Assembly, and you couldn't get an education. This is one of the forces that ended up sending a lot of these mixed race children back to England. Their white parent who's usually a man, because very few white women on the islands. If he cared about his kids, he'd send them over here because there was no rules in place. There was no racial laws here. This is what I'm saying. This is the difference between here and the colonies.
Yeah.
It was all codified there, But here, there was no racial laws. So as a black person, you could come to this country and have far more privileges and be treated much more equally here than you would back in the nation of your, in the colony of your birth. And in America, certain states codified the one drop. So it didn't matter if your black ancestor went back to Adam, you were black, no matter how white you were. So you had this what was called white passing.
What's white passing? White
passing was when people who were black, who may well have been slaves themselves, but they were light enough to be considered to be white, so they could pass for white. And slaves actually, one woman in particular, a woman called Ellen Craft, she actually escaped from slavery by dressing up as a man. And she took her husband with her who was black, who was dark-skinned. And he dressed up as his manservant, and that's how they escaped. They actually come to Liverpool. They actually sailed from the United States to Liverpool to freedom.
And she was posing as a male slave owner.
Yeah, she was as a male slave owner. Yeah, they would do these grand tours where the sons of these rich planters would then travel around the United States, and usually they'd take a manservant with them. So that was the mechanism that she used to get herself and her husband out of bondage.
The reason why I laughed before, partly from nerves and partly from shock, is also because of in a sense, I find it a relief to hear the absurdity of people who try to actually enforce race because of the complexity of it and the fucking paperwork that they have to do to try and figure it out. Because there's a little bit of on this issue, a bit of passive aggression inside of me where I'm like, okay, let's try it then. Let's go back to segregation. Okay, let's go. We've got DNA tests now. Let's try it. It would be a fucking nightmare.
Totally.
Unworkable.
Totally. In relation to Jamaica, you'll see on the baptisms where they're calling the person, whatever, a mulatto or whatever, and it changes. So even the vicar who's looking at the person going, oh yeah, you look like a quarter, and another vicar, so say that woman has a child, one vicar will say she's a quarter, another vicar will say she's a quadroon, and do you know what I mean? Yeah. This is how it works. So it's so subjective.
So actually, people were doing it by sight.
Yeah, so the people would actually would be doing it by sight.
Because when you were saying this to me, I was like, why do they all have records? I mean, in Germany, when people did it with the Jews, they're Germans, so obviously they had the records and they could do it through baptisms and say you're quarter. But in these conditions, so they're actually just looking and going.
Yeah, they'd be looking at them and saying, yeah. And some people would actually be able to say, okay, well, I'll write you down as a musty. So then your kid's a Mustafina, when they might actually be a quadroon. Yeah. I'm 60% black, but people looking at me would think I might be like a quarter or, mulatto as you were called. But I'm 60% black, whereas someone who may have less black blood than me, they'd be darker than me because phenotype doesn't necessarily reflect genotype. Yeah. But that's all, that obviously they weren't really interested in that. It's just social control. Yeah. It's just about keeping everyone in their place within the society that they're in. So forget the science, although they try to use scientific arguments in order to justify it. It's just more about, I want to keep you in your place and I don't really care about what your background is. I just have to ensure that you do not have as many rights as I do, basically, to bring it down to its very lowest. And certainly that's the case in the United States.
So it's pseudoscience.
It's pseudoscience.
We're saying, and just to be clear, whatever side, whether you're right, you're left, you're up, you're down, it doesn't matter. If you're trying to do this now, it's still pseudoscience.
It's pseudoscience.
When I was at university, I did a dissertation on race, and I was trying to find if race was ever applicable scientifically everywhere. And then I found one that was like, with plants. There are races of plants that we can say even with humans, there's just no way of doing it. I like, in a sense, it's awful, but I like the fact that it had to be so. It's almost like Orwellian, Kafka-esque, and then it just becomes a mess, a bureaucratic mess where people are looking. Just a minor point on political correctness. Should we avoid terms from that period like mulatto, like half-caste? I've heard some of the older generation, like people in my family, use it. It's to be avoided, right?
For me, personally, it's to be avoided, but like I've said before, I do not... It's about intention. Do you know what I mean? So if people have learned enough to know that could be considered to be a derogatory term, then you shouldn't use it. But if you're just using it because that's the language of your time, then I didn't have a problem with it whatsoever, because it's out of ignorance, but it's not a negative. It's not meant to be insulting or negative in any way, shape, or form. But race is a spurious concept, so people will use spurious language associated with it. It's inevitable, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
If I could,
because we can't check. We can't be like, come to the lab.
It's rubbish.
And then we'll know.
It's rubbish. It's rubbish. It's just one of those things that we use because we've grown up in a society that at one time valued it, and now it's just become part of our lexicon. You know, it's the language that we use.
And aside from politics, the economics, the socioeconomics, I need you in your place because I'm rich and I want to stay rich. Thanks. There is the psychology, isn't there? I mean, we had a discussion privately about this, of people being attached to notions of genetic determinism. Even if you show them the evidence, they go, there's nothing. We just feel like, I just feel white.
You're challenging people's reality, aren't you? And everything that goes with that.
Yeah.
I hate it around culture.
Yeah.
I've seen it most in my life through culture, growing up in a mixed community that I grew up in. So ideas of like authenticity and what you should be doing in order to consider yourself authentically black or authentically white. You know,
and how's that been as a bookish introverted historian?
There you go. So no one would say it to me because I was read up on the history of black people.
Right.
So no one could ever, but I used to listen to the Doors. I still listen to the Doors.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? I've always loved rock music.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I've always had an interest in things which are much more diverse than just football and, you know, like I say, soul music or whatever it may be.
I saw you post Thin Lizzy the other day playing an Irish song, and I was like, God, I'd forgotten about Thin Lizzy and the Irish folk music.
There you go. Well, he's a really great, you know, no one considered themselves to be more Irish than Philo.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But, you know, a lot of people looking at him, he was the only black man who lived in Crumlin. Do you know what I mean? And it's that type of scenario,
is that where he's from,
isn't it?
Crumlin?
He's from Crumlin,
okay.
just outside Dublin. But for me, it's those ideas of authenticity, which I think are really limiting.
Yeah.
You know, Hendrix is probably my most favorite artist. And, you know, a lot of the times he was criticized by black people because his music was considered to be too white. When obviously he comes out of the blues. So if you know the history of the blues, you know, he's very much in that tradition.
Yes.
He comes out of avant-garde music. Can't think of anything more avant-garde than jazz. That's why so many people hate it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? That's very much another music that you would primarily associate with people of color.
Yeah.
But because of the way he presented that, he was considered to be outside the pantheon of, you know, great black rock musicians. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's really interesting. And I find that as a black person, we're probably we hold on to these ideas of cultural authenticity more than any other group of people.
It's coercive, isn't it?
Certainly from the diaspora. I think that Africans in Africa do not struggle with that as much because they're in the majority there. So acting black is not a thing. You just like what you like. No one will ever challenge you on whether or not you're black. You're from Africa. But you have to kind of strut your stuff out in the diaspora in order to show that you're unapologetically black. Which means if you're a great classical musician, you'll reject that because you should really be working on turntables or sampling. Do you know what I mean? It's so limiting. There's a really good book that I would suggest anyone should read. It's called The Black Atlantic by a guy called Paul Gilroy. Very academic book, but the topics in there are fantastic. And he really challenges all these ideas of what it means to be authentically black from a diasporan perspective when your culture is total mishmash of things that have been taken or borrowed from other people's cultures as well as, you know, African culture. So what does it mean? To be black in the diaspora means to be multicultural.
I know what you mean. Could you just explain that statement to people so that they get it?
So Africans have an African culture based on the societies that they were raised in or a part of. Black people in the diaspora have a diasporan culture, which is separate from what we consider to be African culture. That's why so many people become Afrocentric, where they look back to Africa. But the richness of black culture in the diaspora, whether that's in the Caribbean, South America, or in North America, is because it's a melding of lots of different influences that have helped to create what we now call a black culture. So I talk about jazz.
Homogenized thing, we just say that's black culture.
That's black culture, yeah.
Right.
So you talk about jazz. So is jazz black music? Well, most people, if you were to say that to them, would say yes. I'd have that big debate about, well, what do you mean by, what does it mean to be black?
Yeah.
But most people would say, yeah, of course it's black music. And I'd say, well, how can you play black music on a European instrument? The trombone was not invented in Africa, was it? The saxophone was, you know, what was his name? Adolf Sax. Yeah. You know, it was not created in Africa, but he's playing black music on these instruments that are European.
Yeah.
So what do you mean? You know, he's not playing a kora. You know, he's not playing you know, so it's a mismatch and a melding of cultures and devices from all over the world. Everybody who's gone and settled in, you know, in the Americas, for example, have been influenced by people from other parts of the world. And then you come into those horrible discussions around cultural appropriation, which is another one of these terms that I just despise, you know.
I wasn't going to go there, but seeing as we're in this location, you said sweating a little bit. Okay. Do you think it's, you know how like a white perception of black culture can be tone deaf? Do you think black perceptions of black culture can also be a bit restrictive and tone deaf?
That's what I hope I've just tried to explain.
That's what I thought you were saying. Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So I'm saying that we actually limit the creativity of lots and lots of people from the black community by telling them, whether it's by their peers or their parents or whatever, that's not black. Why are you doing that? I mean, I remember as kids, do you know what I mean? That, you know, doing well in school was not acting black. You'd acting white.
It's not real.
Do you know what I mean? By trying to do well in school.
Yeah.
And again, that was very much a diasporan thing because the African kids were on it, man. Because they were coming from a household that valued that type of stuff.
And they could be in a lot of trouble if they didn't.
You know, well, of course, yeah. And that's a lot to do with the fact that, you know, from diasporan backgrounds, I go back to the history, you know, you come from a society where education was kept away from them.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Specifically, I think we talked about it last time about how slaves were forbidden to read and get an education. So I definitely think there's nuances of that within that type of response.
Almost like a post-traumatic case of being like, well, to be clear, the first time I heard this was Chris Rock. He claimed that if you were caught reading or writing, you'd be punished or maybe even killed.
Yeah. Totally.
So it was absolutely banned to read or write.
Yeah. And if you look at the people who led most of the rebellions, whether that's in Haiti or Nat Turner's rebellion, these were all educated blacks.
And some were royal as well, right?
Some of them would have been royals back in the countries that they'd come from. Even though I've got no love for royalty of any colour. Do you know what I mean? They can all kiss my backside as far as I'm concerned. Inherited privilege. Come on.
Not having that.
I'm not having that. But most of them were educated because education allows people to be able to plan and, you know, develop ideas and stuff. And that's something that I guess obviously the slave owners realised. So that's why they forbade them from being able to acquire that.
I'm feeling courageous. I'll go to a sacred cow here. You mentioned Black Panther last time. Mm-hmm. I've been to Africa a couple of times, to Gambia, and up to Egypt a couple of times. And I don't know much about the culture there, but I've seen it. And when I watched Black Panther and I saw the American representation of African culture, I cringed a little bit. And I was like, I felt confused in the cinema. I was like, I don't know what. I'm like, do you know what I mean? It was like Africa light, or this is Africa style. And it's an American perception. And, you know, when I mentioned tone deafness, just because you have a certain amount of melanin in your skin doesn't mean you can't fuck it up. And so, did you feel that with Black Panther? Like some of it was a bit hokey?
Well, it's Disney-fied, isn't it? It's Marvel. I'm a massive comics fan. I've collected comics since I was a kid. And
nobody's surprised to hear that.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Who's your favourite out of?
God, I've got a few.
You got who's
okay,
no. I'll give you two.
It's changed over time. Yeah. I would probably say Blade.
Blade.
So I've got 3 copies of the first appearance of Blade from Tomb of Dracula, number 10, 1972.
Yeah.
And I've got an Iron Man. Well, I shouldn't be saying this. I should be getting I've got loads, but I grew up loving Wolvie as well.
Yeah.
But I like Black Panther, so I've got Kirby's first edition
of
Black Panther in 1977.
Yeah.
When he finally got his own comic.
Yeah.
But I would say that is a very Disney-fied idea of what Africa's like, but that's how Marvel kind of presented it. It's the whole Wakandan thing.
Yeah.
So people associate Africa with backwardness.
Yeah.
So that's why Wakanda is so far into the future.
Yeah.
You know, it's a direct response to kind of all the negative ideas behind what people think of how people saw Africa, particularly in the 60s when Black Panther was created. So I obviously think that's there, but I think that's because people are so sick of seeing images of poverty and starvation in Africa when we know Africa's got some fantastically developed cities and countries, etc. So I think that's very, very much a response to that. What I do think, though, is that there's a real need to kind of discuss Africa's history in a much wider context. You know, I'm a historian of the slave trade, but Africa's history is so diverse. You know, yeah, when it comes into contact with, you know, with the Northern European powers, maybe in that more of a slavery context, but you can't talk about West Africa's connections to other parts of the world without talking about this much earlier period. And that's something that I think is lost in this dominant discourse around slavery. And I'm saying that as a historian of slavery. And I think if people had this more comprehensive knowledge of the history of Africa, a lot of these opinions that I try and challenge through telling this history would be dealt with at a much earlier stage.
Well, I mean, I suppose I'm going to say something a little bit trite. There's so much to know, but that's true of all history, right? There's just so much to know. Like since talking to you, I've been down some rabbit holes till 2 a.m. with 6 pages open, like going, okay, go back. No, you know, and there is just so much to learn.
Absolutely.
I like the Black Panther character from when I was a kid, and I actually thought the movies were successful, and I thought he was the right casting choice. It was just the juxtaposition of I'm not going to go off on films, but the presumption to lecture against a slightly tone deaf, that didn't sit well with me. You can be Disney, you can show Africa in a Disney film, fine, but at the same time to sort of be wagging the finger, I was like, I think you're gonna have to be careful here. It's not like you've done everything you could have done to represent Africa in an authentic way. So it was, I don't know, being lectured by multi-billion-dollar corporations. It's always it's slightly odd. So one of the things you've mentioned Jamaica a couple of times, and you mentioned Takys Rebellion, and I got onto this just last night. So in Jamaica, is it true that there was a slave trade? The slaves escaped slavery, formed their own sort of colony. Then new slaves came, and if any of those new slaves escaped, they were the original.
Yeah. So that's the Maroons.
Please explain the Maroons to me.
I mean, it's simple, really. This is why I think the context of blackness and what it means to be black is as diverse as whiteness. Do you know what I mean? So if you've done all right if you've got a group of people and you've done all right for yourselves, why not keep that? Wouldn't you keep that for yourself if there was anything that might encroach on that?
Absolutely.
Most people would, wouldn't they?
Yeah. Especially in harsh environments.
Yeah, well, especially when you're fighting for your life. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? So you're a runaway slave and you've realised I've earned my freedom and I can stay free. So you make a treaty with the English who say, okay, you've won your freedom. You stay in the mountains. But if we ever need you because another slave's run away, you come and help us
Who took the original slaves? And do you know roughly when the original slaves went to Jamaica?
The original slaves, so
the Maroons, because they're aren't they from 200 years before?
Well, the people were always running away and would join Maroon communities, but there was runaway communities from this very, very early period, from the time of the Spanish. So this is before Cromwell captures the island in 1655. They think it comes from Cimarron, so which is like wild horse. So the Maroons go back to the time when the Spanish had the island, and they then became a thing. But then you also had people going and who ran away and joined the Maroons after that date.
So the Spanish took West African slaves.
The Spanish were the first people to take slaves to Jamaica.
Right.
And then we capture it from them in 1655.
Okay.
And then we, as always, the British do bigger and better. So we're like the nation who really industrialize it.
Right.
Certainly to the Caribbean from about 1700 right up until abolition. And so lots more people are coming in then. So there's wars against the Maroons on more than one occasion.
Why are they called the Maroons?
Because, well, they think the etymology of the word is it probably comes from Cimarron, which is a Spanish word for like wild horse or something.
Oh, okay. So Cimarron became
Maroon.
Maroon.
Yeah,
Maroons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, and so, making me lose my train of thought now.
Sorry, mate.
And so, that then became a separate culture. So you got Maroon Town, and you had a lot of different towns that were actually, enclaves of free slaves. And because they had this treaty with the British, even up until today, they have autonomy, even on the island of Jamaica, because of this treaty.
They have a separate autonomy.
They have a separate autonomy.
And
they're very proud of their history.
Well, they should be, because they survived with nothing. Yeah. Jamaica, not the Jamaica that I was thinking of, but the Jamaica that you had me go and look up the history of. How many ways to die, and horrible tropical diseases that eat your bones and peel your skin off, and what you do, you've got no medicine. These were hardcore survivalists tough as fuck.
Absolutely.
Fled. They rebelled. They fought for their freedom, and then they ran off into the woods. And you just think, well, you got about 2 weeks, mate. I mean, but they actually survived and thrived
and established full, long-standing communities.
So then, when your man Thomas Thistlewood goes, they're already there on the island, and ready to be employed if need be. If you need people who are capable survivalists on Jamaica, and they would be hired to actually hunt runaway slaves as well,
and help to put down rebellions like Takys Rebellion.
So what happened with Takys Rebellion?
Well, he rose up, wanted to obviously set the island on a light, and it was put down with the help of the Maroons.
And so the suppression of the rebellion, we shouldn't imagine a bunch of white people with rifles doing it.
It's much more complex than that.
Yeah.
It's ideas of every man for himself in a society like that. That's what you got to understand. This idea of black solidarity is not something that is universal,
right?
Because you got, at the end of the day, charity begins at home, doesn't it? You got to make sure that you're okay before you can think about freeing everybody else. And so that's what a lot of the reasons why we look to people like Toussaint and think, wow, how was he able to do what he did? One of the greatest freedom fighters in history. This is the man who obviously created Haiti as the first independent black republic, and
is that Tacky?
No, this is later on. This is in French. This is in Haiti, on the island of Saint Domingue.
Yeah,
but Tacky rebellion was put down again with great brutality. There was never a truly successful slave rebellion on the island of Jamaica.
If the whites didn't have the Maroons. Sorry to use the social construct again. If the Europeans didn't have the Maroons there, they wouldn't have succeeded in putting it down.
No.
Well, one of the things that surprised me reading about Thomas Thistlewood was his nephew came over to visit, and he was engaged in rape and torture. The slaves hated him. He was found drowned. And then on the anniversary of his death, it says they blew horns and fired their guns. So I was like, did they have...
Some of them had guns, some of them were armed, but you'd only give guns to trusted slaves.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they would be the drivers.
Yeah, they'd be people in positions of authority. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. Fear was used to control everyone. It was, for you to rise up against your owners.
Yeah.
That was that was a death sentence if you didn't succeed.
Yeah.
And most people, there was no, you hadn't seen anyone succeed in the past.
Yeah.
So why would you think you would succeed? There was all kinds of mechanisms that were put in place in order to ensure that the status quo remained. And some of them obviously meant that black people had to have some positions of authority, which would give them access to guns, for example. But, if you blow the head off your owner, you might feel some personal satisfaction, but then you're probably going to get hung, drawn and quartered. So is that really what you want to,
And when you say hung, drawn and quartered, let's just briefly go into how bad in Jamaica the level of violence was. What would punishment, if I ran away and was caught, what kind of a punishment could I expect?
It depends.
Yeah.
It's lashings. You could have, you'd be manacled. You could be hobbled. There was so many things. They thought up lots of really interesting ways to kind of punish recalcitrant slaves, to dehumanize them, croppings, it's when I think about it, it just makes me, chopping noses off, blinded in one eye, branding, cropping ears, take a finger, they do all kinds of.
It's like something like Hostel or something, the torture porn movies of the 2000s.
Absolutely, and they think of lots of really innovative ways of kind of inflicting pain.
Thistlewood didn't think that normal flogging was enough, so he would marinate people who'd been recently flogged in, what was it, lime?
Lime juice, salt and pepper. Used to put chili in the wounds and stuff.
And then keep them in the wounds.
Yeah. And lie them in molasses and let the flies eat them, basically.
Them up.
Yeah.
And this is you said it, are they called buboes or bilbos? The ankles chains were put on them. I know it's gross. Can you tell us what Darby's dose is?
Oh, well, this was a particular torture that Thistlewood thought up, where he would get one of the slaves to defecate into the mouth of one of the other slaves who'd done some type of wrong, done something wrong. And it wasn't necessarily even for running away. It could be doing something wrong or making a mistake or something.
I read that somebody got it for not working hard enough.
Yeah. So
he just was in a mood, probably syphilitic, drunk. It's a real story of, I mean, there's barbarism, and you look at like Roman stories or Greek stories, barbarism. There's something more depraved. It's like lazy. It's messy. Obviously, he's sometimes he's up, sometimes he's down, and he just has the permission to do
these
this.
are real human stories, and because his diaries survive, you get it from you get that first-hand account, which you might not necessarily get if you're thinking about those other contexts that you talk about, but you know what he's thinking about when he's doing these vicious and nasty things to people. And all that's been separated, I think, when we're talking more generally. When we talk about the slave trade, people do not understand the true horrors of the trade, because you don't hear them articulated in the first person. Do you know what I mean? Like Darby's Dose, like some of the torture, people were really shocked by some of the scenes in 12 Years a Slave. So the long hanging, for example, that was everyday stuff. Do you know what I mean?
I was going to raise that with you, actually. I was like, when I saw 12 Years a Slave, there was a couple of the scenes where, played by Michael Fassbender, where you get these close-up shots of a slave being whipped and the contortions of agony. And then, I can't remember the director's name, he liked to juxtapose the black face and the white face. And the white face is contorted also in an agony of hatred and sadism.
Steve McQueen.
Great filmmaker, but some of the films he makes are hard to watch. It's the IRA protest movie he made. I think it's called Hunger or something like that. So that's a tough one. And I was watching it, and I was like, some of this, like he did it 3 times, and I was like, this is becoming almost a caricature. This white slave master is so evil, it's almost like falling away into a caricature now, because every scene he's just in this fury of like. And then you read these diaries and you're like, actually, that was a toned down version of a real man. And I think I didn't read the diary itself, but some of the excerpts, the humanness of it makes it horrible. He rapes young slaves when he's very sick with venereal disease. He's covered in syphilis, and then feels bad afterwards and gives them coins. And he's just like, fucking hell.
That was it.
It's horrifying, isn't it?
See, that's why, like, as someone who I look at the legacies of slavery in the North American context. That's why I think that people in the 1960s and 70s had no problem bombing churches and blowing up little girls and stuff like that. Yeah. Because if you've come out of this society and a culture, which is, your Fassbender character, where, this torture, is an everyday occurrence. Why would that seem particularly horrific to you in the 1960s when you've just grown up within that society that says, no, that's perfectly, they're not human. You can do whatever you want to them. When they get uppity, burn them to death, lynch them, whatever it may be. And they're that's living memory. 1964, when they bombed the church in Birmingham, Alabama, that's living memory. You can't tell me that is still not in the psyche, or is not still in the psyche of people today, because your parents were doing it or your grandparents were doing it. Do you know what I mean? And that's why I think America still struggles with so many of these issues that it does around race today.
Well, I think I did an interview for somebody else recently, and I was talking about boarding school and what the experience of boarding school was like. And I was like, it's almost like psychopath training camp, because the way that we as kids were treated was with a good deal of hostility, way too much hostility. And you become cruel, you become sadistic. And I do think there, but for the grace of God go we all, like, we talk about psychopathy and narcissism. We go, oh, those people over there, those bad people, they have that. And I'm like, we're one famine away, or one war away, or one atrocity away from all of us have it, because in an environment where empathy and compassion will kill you, of course you're going to become less and less and less.
Absolutely.
Why would you? These are the sort of the pretensions of a wealthy world. You need to be rich, really, for the we should have compassion and we should have empathy, of course. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but you need to be the culture needs to be quite well off to afford it, doesn't it? So, and I do think you can have induced, in fact, I think it's all probably induced psychopathy And if you're in enough pain, you will lash out.
When people's bellies aren't full, they'll do whatever they have to do in order to get that feeling of full. I'm okay now. Now I can worry about maybe doing something for you. But until I'm there, you're just there to make sure that I get to that point. And that's what I think is very much part of the human condition,
And not to belabor the point, but you just mentioned 1965. And then I only found out, to my shame, about 8 months ago that the Emancipation Proclamation was only 1865.
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation is 1863.
63.
All the slaves are finally freed in 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation is interesting because that's really what prevents Britain from being able to get into the war. It was very much an act by Lincoln that he didn't really want to do.
Right.
But he did it because he realised that would keep Gladstone and, the others who wanted to get Britain to get involved in the war from actually getting involved in the war.
Oh, so he did that to be like, okay, let's keep
basically what he was saying is that he made it into an issue of slavery.
Mm.
And the British obviously couldn't be seen to be supporting the side that wanted to maintain slavery if the ones in the north no longer wanted to maintain it. So it was a very astute move. I've heard Frederick Douglass may well have advised them about that as well. So
the idea of Lincoln being the progressive, on anti-slavery guy might be a little bit questionable.
Yeah.
I just those two dates, like it's 100 years. People owned to the point of like you're a chair, you're a chattel, you're a cow. It's the same. You have the same rights, the same level. 100 years later, and with no transition, no broad scale effort at integration. I don't even know. There was I think I saw it the County of Free Jones, the Matthew McConaughey movie.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it. Yeah,
it's all right. There are parts of the movie where it's implied that freed slaves should get something, some amount of money.
40 acres and a mule.
40 acres and a mule. Did that actually happen?
No. You never got the 40 acres and a mule.
So they just got nothing?
They got nothing. Most of them stayed sharecroppers, stayed working for the people who had owned them beforehand.
Because there was nothing else
to go, no education. What are you supposed to do? You got freedom and freedom to starve.
Freedom to do what?
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that was very much... You know what you say about 1965? In the 1930s, WPA, which is the workers, can't remember what the acronym's for, but they went around interviewing freed slaves who were still alive in the 1930s. Now, these are people who remembered what it meant to be. You can listen to them all; they're all available online. And I think Alan Lomax went along with them, the guy who went and recorded loads of blues music in the 40s as well. And that's how close it was. You could, in the States, you could easily have, if you were around in the 30s, you could have easily met someone who'd been born a slave.
I think Dave Chappelle said his grandmother was, not great grandmother, his grandmother. It's very, very close, and I don't want to sound like I'm adopting a position or I have any kind of a solution. I don't. It's just. Imagine I just got beamed down to earth today and all I know about is psychology and you tell me that, I'd open my fat trap and be like, well, there's no fucking way that they can integrate. Like there's zero. And how many centuries? I don't know, 5, 6, maybe. And people would need to forget. And they would basically, you'd kind of, to be vulgar, you'd fuck it out. You would just, and then eventually, but it would be 4 or 5 centuries. There has to be some kind of integration of that trauma and recognition that it's not historical. It's still
absolutely.
It's still, but passing that is quite hard, isn't it? Like, where is it still going on?
Jim
today?
Crow. That's where we come into Jim Crow, don't we? Yeah. So after Reconstruction, so a Liverpool clergyman went to the United States during the period of Reconstruction, and he said that black people were treated better in the South than in the North. He'd seen black people pulled off buses, in omnibuses as they were now, horse-drawn buses, and thrown to the ground. Whereas down in the South, they were treated with respect. Now that might shock everyone, but during Reconstruction, the United States Army was on the streets of the South of the seceding states in order to ensure that black people's rights were not impinged upon.
Yeah, people tend to be more polite when there's guns
exactly,
pointed at them.
Exactly. And then as soon as they were removed in 1877, the Ku Klux Klan resurges, all the terrorism associated with them, domestic terrorism, as we would call it today. And black people lose all those, all those privileges that they once had. I mean, during Reconstruction, Mississippi elected a black senator. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So there's never been one since Reconstruction.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
What period is Reconstruction?
Between the end of the Civil War in 1877, so for like 12 years.
And how long did he serve as senator?
Well, he served that entire. He served his until they lost the right to vote. So after his term ends a couple of years after.
That's a good question. Then, so did they have the right to vote for those 12 years?
Yeah, totally. The freedom.
Oh, they had the right to vote. They had the right.
So hence the reason
and then it was taken away.
Mississippi had a black senator just because black people could vote.
Okay.
There was an attempt to kind of ensure that black people would be able to hold on to those full rights, former slaves.
So some people were saying you should have rights and there should be integration.
Yeah, well, they
some.
Again, I'm not sure how strong they were on the integrationist side of things, but
rights.
Black people should at least be separate but equal.
Separate
type of
but
thing.
equal. Okay.
Yeah.
So not integrated, segregated, but with rights.
Yeah.
And then somebody came along and they did have voting rights for 12 years. And then they went backwards.
Yeah. And they still haven't had one since. That shows how like race is such a part of the American psyche, isn't it? You see everything in racial terms.
How did they lose? How did they justify taking away their voting rights?
Because they got back the power after Reconstruction. Those soldiers are no longer there to make sure that you're not
Sorry, it wouldn't be a federal decision. It would have been a state by state.
Yeah, state by state.
Okay.
So then they brought in like poll taxes and all types of laws.
Did the
if your father was a slave, then you couldn't vote, or if your grandfather was a slave, or literacy tests. So obviously loads of these people couldn't read or write because they'd never been taught. So if you couldn't read or write, you couldn't vote. These are all the ways that they disenfranchised them over time.
And was this did most states in America do it? Or was this predominantly in the South?
Predominantly in the South, in all the slave-holding states.
So if you were up in Dakota, you could still vote. Maybe. Maybe.
On paper.
On paper, you could. Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know that it moved forward and then went backwards.
Yeah. Reconstruction's a really interesting period to look at. Because again, that's what leads to.
You've already ruined my history of America because I thought it was white people just going across from the east to the west.
Gone west, my son.
West. No, and apparently up until the 1820s, it's majority. The most of the people in America are slaves.
Mm-hmm.
A side note: would they have been? They wouldn't have been considered American, would they?
No, well,
they're not citizens.
Well, no, because they're property. So
okay.
See, but they are referred to in the Constitution. Is it Article 1, Section 2? I think it's Article 1, Section 2. It talks about black people for taxation purposes were considered 3/5 of a human being. So kind of like for tax.
Could you imagine sitting in a room and going, That's
America, mate.
It should be half. Half is too much. Let's make them three.
At the same time that they're having these discussions about unalienable rights, and we hold it self-evident that all men are created equal. Men, not women, but men are created equal. Do you know what I mean? They're having these discussions at the same time that they're codifying, race laws.
And then under their breath, obviously not black,
slaves.
Apart from the slaves.
And I know that they had. You know what we were talking about the moral argument. We know that they were having these like moral discussions even within themselves, because you see it. George Washington, whether or not he thought slavery was a good or bad thing, we can't really say explicitly. But when he dies, he frees all his slaves. He doesn't free his wife's slaves because they weren't his per se, but he frees all his own slaves.
Okay.
So you get these types of, what late at night when he was lying in his bed after he's won the Revolutionary War. Is he thinking this is all just a big effing charade? Do you know what I mean? It's all about us just keeping our position of privilege, kicking out the king because we want to be the controllers of our own destiny. We don't want to pay taxes to him.
I've read some of his writings. He's not a stupid man.
No.
And I don't think he would have been deluded. He must have known it was bullshit. Must have done. Or I'm wrong, and people in those days just lived in a kind of weird split where they would, I don't know, you do this when you go to church and you do this when you're... It's more there's such hypocrisy tied up with the with the establishment of the
the United States, isn't it? Wanting to flee tyranny, or wanting to be free of tyranny, and then every time you go out onto your plantation, there you are with forced laborers.
Yeah, imposing tyranny.
Come on,
we're all for freedom, not for you.
Yeah, there you go.
Not for you, or 3/5 of you. Speaking of cognitive dissonance and hypocrisy, if we could go back to the Caribbean for a second. I really like bachata music. I like bachata dance. I learned how to do it here in Liverpool.
Okay.
And I've been to the Dominican a few times. And the last time I went to the Dominican, I trod on a bit of a landmine socially. I realized Dominicans do not consider themselves to be black.
Not at all. Not at all. That's an insult to associate them. Yeah.
I got a bit of a shock because could you tell us what the history of that is and why that is?
To a certain extent, yeah. Well, they're a very mixed race population. Obviously, the Spanish didn't go there in large numbers. So they had children with black enslaved people.
So the Spanish went to the Dominican Republic first.
That was the first place Columbus landed. Hispaniola, the island.
Hispaniola is the island.
Little Spain.
And that's and they took some.
Well, then
West
the French, so they start transporting slaves, but they didn't. The Spanish were not interested in growing sugar. They were more interested in gold and silver. So Dominican Republic stayed underdeveloped for a long time because the Spanish then went off to the mainland and enslaved lots of Africans and Native Americans and put them down into mines to mine.
Who enslaved Native Americans? Sorry,
it's the Spanish.
The Spanish did.
Yeah.
In Hispaniola and
the Spanish. First of all, there was no Africans there. Yeah, so they enslaved the native populations. The native populations did not do well due to European diseases like smallpox, etc.
Yeah.
And obviously they were then wiped out by genocide. In many ways. So Bartholomew de las Casas, he's the guy who really instigates the transatlantic slave trade, because he recommends that all these poor native savages, these poor Amerindian savages as we call them today, they can't cope with this hard work. Rather than work them into the ground and kill them all, bring over the African. The African is much more suited to this type of hard labor. And that's what led really to the beginnings of the Spanish importing large-scale African populations into the Caribbean.
Were Native Americans ever attempted to be enslaved in North America?
They had more space to run.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But I mean, you saw the same types of things that went on over there that went on in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
But they had obviously an entire continent as opposed to an island that they could
easier
run.
to escape.
Yeah.
So, I don't know which way around to do this. Is it best to talk about the formation of the split between Dominican and Haiti?
Yeah, well, you can do, yeah. So basically, I mean, first of all, the Spanish never really developed San Domingo, it was called, for sugar, because they were interested in gold and silver. So that was pretty underdeveloped. The French, on the other hand, much more of a Northern European thing. They very much exploited Haiti, and you can look at if you do like a Google satellite map, look at the island of the island of Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and you'll see just how less green Haiti is compared to the side that's the Dominican Republic. Although now obviously they grow loads of sugar in the Dominican Republic, and they use Haitian forced laborers who they lock up at night so they can't leave.
Today?
The Faneuil brothers. Do you know about the history of the? Well, it's like a continuous. This history, it's not dealt with. What you saw going on those islands 200 years ago, you see in a slightly modified form going on today. But basically, the French capture the western half of the island, and they established that as Saint-Domingue, which was Haiti, and they very much that was the jewel of the French Antilles, the way that Jamaica was the jewel of the British. And they, heavily exploited for sugar. It was more productive than Jamaica. That's why the British were always wanting to capture it. And they tried after the revolution and failed dismally. Kept us out of the wars against the French on the continent for years.
Right.
So Haiti becomes like the French side of Saint-Domingue, where they did not tend to have the same type of pastoral relationship that they had on the other side of the island. So there was less mixed race people
right,
on the Haitian side of the island. And again, you see that. If you look at Dominicans today, they look like me. When I've been to Dominican Republics, people have spoken to me in Spanish thinking I'm Dominican. And so they look at themselves, because of all the negative associations with Haiti and people of African descent, which go back to the slave trade period. They don't identify with their African blood, even though they're obviously, to me and you would say, no, mate. Yeah, you might have some white blood in your back down in, 4 generations ago, but, you're black. Trujillo, who was the guy who the Americans, the leader of the island, who the Americans killed, he used to put white makeup on his face.
Really?
Because
himself up?
Yeah, whitening his skin, because he didn't want to associate himself with being, of African origin, because that's so inculcated into the people. Black was bad, you know. Light-skinned people, there was privilege for light-skinned people in those societies.
I didn't even, I'm ashamed to admit it, didn't get onto it until the last time I was there. And it was when I got outside of Santo Domingo, and then I was in a resort, and I was like, I can see the way the jobs are being dished out here. There's
Cleaners black, dark-skinned, mainly Haitians.
Yeah. Anybody carrying a machete doing gardening, they're Haitian. And I could get the accent. I was like, oh, it's like a French person speaking Spanish. And I started and then I looked at the history and I found an attempted genocide. So I mean, for me, I was like, oh, I love this music. I love this place. And then I was like, the Dominican Republic actually had a fascist government for a little while there. Trujillo was an out and out fascist.
The US assassinated him.
What? Why did they?
He was getting too troublesome. He wasn't doing what he wanted them to do. Do you know what I mean? America occupied Haiti, didn't he, in the early part of the 20th century as well. So that's always been their backyard.
Right.
Can't have anyone. Everyone's got to be in your pocket. Do you know what I mean?
So what I read was in 1939, Trujillo, this fascist chap who's in charge, demands the expulsion of Haitians. They don't go from the northwest, so he sends soldiers down to just massacre. And obviously that is still...
This is the bloody history of the Caribbean, mate. You
warned me, didn't you? You did say
it's a dark history.
Yeah.
Because when it's all based on, first of all, it's the beginnings of modern capitalism.
Yeah.
In order to make that a reality, you had to be willing to chop heads, because you had to either force people to work. Yeah. Well, usually it was to force people to work, so you had to inflict a lot of brutality. Yeah. Off the back of that type of oppressive system, you're always going to get insurrections. So you use brutality to stop or to prevent that. Or if when those things break out, you put them down with such ferocity. Life is cheap, as we talked about, because sugar work is so difficult that you're just worn out, literally worn out. I think the life expectancy, not the life expectancy, but the average age at death was like 23. Do you know what I mean? So you're working your whole life from a child, and then you're old if you make it to 24. Do you know what I mean? You've done better than what you should have on average. That's what you're talking about. That, like we talked about earlier on, that's got to have some impact on how the society is structured and how it develops over time. Yeah. And that's something that you still see in the 21st century, I would suggest. Life is short, it's cruel, it's brutal. It's all about exploiting. Get what you can while you can. You're not going to be here for long. Why plan? Why think about doing things like building the road? Forget that. Do you know what I mean? That's something that benefit people long into the future. No, you just make sure you've got what you need. And that goes from the people on the lowest rungs of the social economic ladder right up to the highest rungs of the social and economic ladder.
So you think some of the legacy of that we'll see today in the Dominican and other Caribbean countries is there isn't that long-term planning as much as you'd see in other places, and there's a tendency towards a certain mindset.
And when anyone does that or thinks like that, they're deposed.
Right.
Because we don't want that. We don't want organized societies in places like, look what happened in Guatemala, the United Fruit Company, back in the 50s. These are the types of things you don't want settled societies that are thinking about the future and are trying to do what's best for their own inhabitants. It's just about wealth extraction, isn't it? Now it's multinationals doing it instead of Thomas Thistlewood and people like that.
Right.
And I think that's a legacy of this, how these places developed over time.
Yeah.
The only difference with the United States is white people settled there. Do you know what I mean? So because white people settled there, then you create a society which is structured. Same with South Africa, as opposed to West Africa. because the climate was more tolerable.
Yeah.
We'll actually settle, and you'll have colonial settler societies rather than just extraction, you know?
So when, in the case of Jamaica, I actually want to know for Dominican as well, when did Jamaica become, to use the social construct, black governed? When were the whites out?
Okay, well, this is interesting because, again, I would suggest that one of the reasons why most of those, even though I accept colorism as a thing, not so much in this society, but certainly in the Caribbean, etc. So if you look at the people who, once it was black governed, were black, there's very few. They were mainly what you'd call people of color or mixed race, which is part of the history. You know, privilege was based on your skin color in many ways in places like Jamaica. So Michael Manley, you know, Siega, all these people, these were all very light-skinned people. Siega may well have been able to pass. He had straight hair as well, whereas Manley had a bit of a fro. But Jamaica becomes a independent country in the 1960s, early 60s. Oh, wow. And that's when, you know, we don't have a white governor ruling the island, although by that time, obviously, they'd put people of colour into positions of power.
Yeah.
But it didn't actually become
the legacy remained.
And the legacy remains.
To this day.
Totally, without a doubt. Like you just said earlier on, these things cannot get resolved in a one century.
No.
You know,
no, that time frame is too short.
Yeah, it's far too short. It took longer than that to establish it. It'll take longer than that to change it.
In the Dominican, did Haiti have? Haiti obviously had white governance for a while.
Yeah,
European
before 1791, you get the Haitian Revolution.
Okay.
1804, Designation, it becomes an independent state. So again, the mixed race population in Haiti had a little bit more power than the whites. Right. So they saw themselves as a separate entity, kind of like what you saw in Dominican Republic. Yeah, yeah. Whereas it's remained much more like that in Dominican because of its different history. Yeah. Whereas black people kind of ended up slaughtering a lot of the mixed race people because they too were using their color as a privilege.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. So a lot of them were also done away with because they held privilege as the sons of these sons and daughters of these white planters.
Almost like a Marxist revolution. You were privileged, so you need to go.
Yeah, that's what it was. And some of them did. Some of them didn't associate themselves with being black. It's like what you're saying. You tell someone who's mixed race in the Dominican that they're black, they want to fight you. Do you know what I mean? It was very much on the island during the 18th century when there was privilege associated with it. Yeah, that was something that they also saw themselves as very much a part of. The French, the mixed race French people, French on Haiti, or the mixed race Haitians. Yeah, that was very much something that they also ascribed to.
I felt like in the modern Dominican Republic, there's still an awful lot there to be unveiled. There's a lot I don't understand. There was a lot of I could see there was women in the capital because it has money. There's money there, and they were dressed, which in a way I can't even describe, exactly the way the women on the money. So they're dressing like something from 60, 70, 80 years ago, and they carry themselves with sort of like a nobility. And I was like, there's something here. I know there's code. I haven't cracked it, but obviously it's a very class-based society. Totally. Yeah.
Textiles were so important to the slave trade as well. Right. So the way you dressed showed how much wealth you had because textiles were one of the main goods. Right. That was traded for enslaved people. So if you were in an island, you dressed like you had money. That was
That's how you showed where your proper place on the dominance hierarchy. And just to briefly come back to it, you're saying that to this day there's forced labor of Haitians in the Dominican Republic.
Definitely in sugar production. Yeah. There's a really good, it's not a great film, but it's a good film that was narrated by Paul Newman. I think it was one of the last things he did before he died, called Sugar. And that really looks into this in the modern context. So this film must be about 15 years old, maybe a little bit more. And he talks about, how Haitians are basically kept as forced laborers on plantations. At nighttime, they go to bunks, they're locked in, and they're only let out in the morning to go back to the cane fields. And still to this day, one of the hardest manual jobs you can do is chopping cane. Still mainly done by hand. So, there's not much chance of that changing because mechanization doesn't play the same role in sugar production as it does in other crops.
You just basically can't have a machine for it that.
So currently. So they have these large gangs of, just forced laborers, like I say, who get locked up. You're not free to come and go as you want. You can't go into Santo Domingo and have a night out.
Yeah.
You're locked up.
Yeah. And if you did go into Santo Domingo, obviously I don't know, but I wonder what the reception is like.
Exactly. Well, they've just passed this law quite recently, haven't they, to start, even if you're born in the Dominican Republic, or your grandparents were born, you're still a Haitian and can be deported.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's terrible. And it's all based on skin color. Do you know what I mean? Like you go on a bus in Haiti, and if you're black American, dark, they stop you every so often, and the soldiers will get on. And 9 out of 10 times, the only people that they're interested in is the darker skinned people.
Really?
Yeah, totally. Because it's in many ways, it's like what you'd see in the United States years ago.
Because I asked you about the Maroons putting down the rebellions in Jamaica. I'm not deliberately highlighting situations where you have. I mean, you said there's a myth of black solidarity. Mm-hmm. I think trying to challenge these simplistic narratives, I think, is really, really critical.
Yeah,
and there's so much nuance to all of this stuff.
I mean, again, it's like necessity was the main reason why people did the things that they did. As I said on the slave ships, when I said the first time, Africans became black when they ended up on the slave ships because that was what homogenized them. So they stopped being Fulbe, Fulani, Igbo, Yoruba, on that slave ship and just became black because it was in the context outside of Africa, outside and away from their cultures that they just became homogenized. Now, that meant that they had to unify in order to get by, and many of them did. So the ideas of fictive kinship. So, when I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but obviously slaves were sold out of families. So it became almost de rigueur that, if a child came to a plantation, someone would mother that child and they would bring them into their family, even though they had no genetic relationship with them. This became something that came out of the slave trade. You'd look after an orphan child because he'd been sold away from his parents or whatever. And these ideas of fictive kinship then become really significant.
I've never heard that phrase before, fictive kinship.
Yeah, well, it's the idea of it's not a real kinship based on genetics. It's based on, you're obviously someone who's in need and I'm going to protect you because that's what we do But
that would have originally been forced by masters, by slave masters.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, yeah, but you might do it reluctantly, but people would do it out of feeling that that's what you do culturally. So it's an obligation.
I'm with you.
So it's not like, oh, I've got to look after you.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? People would welcome them into the family because that's something that became part of black culture. This is what I'm saying, black, or you could even say in that case, slave culture. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It became something that the enslaved would do that was seen to be done because of this terrible situation, that this Holocaust that we are a part of. That's what you do. You become a parent to an orphan child. Yeah. Because that's part of your culture. That becomes something that you very much do.
Do you think that's echoed forward in America? Do you think that
I've seen not just in America, that was something obviously that was universal, that would happen to people in the Caribbean as well.
In the diaspora.
Yeah, I've seen that in my own culture and my own family, that was something that, you would take in the orphan. Do you know what I mean? That was something that there was an honor. It became like an honor. That was something that you did, because that was culturally what you did, within the black community. And that's one of the great things that I think has come out of the terrible history of slavery. So there's a culture. This is the thing that I think we've got to get over. And when we talk about this myth of solidarity, there's times when solidarity was very real. But in this case of the Maroons, my first loyalty wasn't to the runaway slave. It was to all the other Maroons who were in that community. So if we need to keep our freedom by ensuring that runaways cannot run away, then that's what we do, because that's in our treaty. We've fought hard, we've lost. Don't forget, if you're fighting in a war, you're going to lose loved members of your community. If you get that hard fought for treaty from the superpower, the British, which it was, you got to understand that, Britain is a superpower, the first industrial superpower during this age, then you take it. And if that means that you have to return runaway slaves, then you do it. Yeah. Because that's what keeps you free. So that's where your first loyalty was too. And then
You and
obviously,
yours,
and then in other contexts, we did rise up as a community, as you know, and with just our slave culture and our blackness, you know. And then you have the nuance. So, you know, we've been talking about how mixed race people saw themselves differently. Then if you look at some of the greatest freedom fighters for black people, were people who people would now call mixed race. Frederick Douglass was a mulatto. Nat Turner was a mixed race man. W.E.B. Du Bois at the beginning of the century could have almost passed, you know, but these were people who during the slave period and then after emancipation continued to see themselves as part of this black, you know, this black community rather than seeing themselves as, well, I was light skinned, so I've got a bit more privilege over you when you're darker. So it works both ways. Do you know what I mean? There was black solidarity, but there was also times where people from different backgrounds didn't show any solidarity. That's all part of the culture. It doesn't come out of this vacuum. Do you know what I mean? We woke up one day and we were all thought the same way. That was never, and we still don't.
It's not a hive mind.
It's not a hive mind, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting how the context and the socioeconomic pressures and the power structures influence behavior. Of course they do. Depends
and I think it's racism that makes us think that all black people should be united. So I have to deal with a lot of white people saying to me, well, the blacks sold each other. And I have to respond the way I respond. Okay, so when were the whites selling each other when the Irish were sold by the Bristolians during the medieval period? No, because having the same skin color does not mean that you've got any type of, you know, affinity or, you know, any type of positive feeling towards somebody else until you put them in a society where you are judged based on your color, and that's outside. That's after the slave trade has taken place. So we talked about the Dora Milaje, you know, the Dahomey and Warren. They didn't think the Yoruba were their brothers and sisters, so they sold them to the white man.
I was thinking, like, oh, you shoved me in a room with, like, I don't know, Albanians, Russians, and I don't know, Germans. And I'm like, no, there's no fucking solidarity. And then I was like, where would there be if you stuck me in an American jail where it's like on the West Coast where it's proper segregated and we're going to get shanked up unless we form a gang? Yeah, they're now my white brothers.
That's when identity politics works for you. There you go.
Yeah, I'll be like, I'm into it now. Everything I said before on YouTube, forget all that. This is what makes sense.
That's it.
Your politics would shift quickly if you thought you were going to get killed
once you're in that crucible.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You can be, you know, we can talk about these interesting nuances on the, but when you're in that situation, you're very much gonna. So I'd be buggered though, because they probably think I wouldn't feel like I was a Latino. Do you know what I mean? You know,
you try with the Dominicans.
I hope the brothers would be down with me because I got love. Do you know what I'm saying? Remember Huey? Remember Frederick Douglass? All these light skin. You know, that's the kind of way I kind of, you know, look at things.
Well, I mean, there must have been situations like this where people have been. I read about a guy called Walter White last night, and he described himself as black. And I was looking at the picture of him, and I was like, "Yeah, you're as blonde and blue-eyed as me." But he, who was the
NAACP?
NAACP. He did apparently some good work for. Yeah, and I'm black.
Yeah, that's black. That's what I said to you about white passing.
Right.
There's people who you could look at, but because you're growing up in a crucible where if anybody in your family was black, you were black, you identified with that.
Saying as we're talking about appearances, we've been talking about appearances for a little while. Do you think it's different here in Liverpool?
Massively.
It's definitely it is different.
It's massively different because you see, this comes back to what we're saying about race being a social construct, and it's constructed differently based on your geographical location and your history.
Right.
So Liverpool has this very long history of black settlement. Primarily, certainly in the earlier period, it was men because it was seamen. Yeah, who were coming here. And then even if we go back to the slave trade period, it was usually an 80-20% split. So it was only 20% of women on those ships and 80% were men. So chances were that it was black men settling here, and if they had relationships and families, it tended to be with white people. Now, over generations, that would wax and wane. That's what happened with my family. They got lighter and then darker because a black person married into the family. That's very much how it was. But because we're in this old community, that's why we look so different. I remember coming up from London on the train once with a black guy, and we were having a good chat, and goes, "You know what really shocked me about Liverpool?" And I said, "No, what?" And he goes, old mixed race people. I freaked me out, couldn't believe it, because where I live in London, you know, the only mixed race people you see were the kids.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? But in Liverpool, because we had this history of black settlement going back 300 years, obviously you're going to have mixed race people who were born in the 19th century. You know, the first black Scouser born in Liverpool that I know of was probably mixed race.
Yeah.
He was the son of a slave called Mercury.
Right.
And his mother, you know, they weren't married, so he'd probably got the leg over with Mary Smith and had a baby with her. So, you know, there's been a mixed race black community here from the 1750s at least. Do you know what I mean? And that's only something that's, you know, continued right up to the present day. So I'm very aware as well, because this colorism argument seems to become quite topical at the moment. In Liverpool, it's always been mixed race people who've been in the vanguard of kind of fighting for black people's rights. Yeah. You know, amongst black people, don't like people who you might call black, because I call everyone black who identifies as black, with it being a social construct. Yeah. But when I look at those pictures, and I remember the marches I went on as a 5-year-old, there were black people of every hue, and lots of white people as well, because our families were made up of people from all races. Yeah. And because of that, I equate Liverpool in many ways to like an American city. So you have the black community, which lives in one specific part of the town. And then that community is made up of people of lots of different backgrounds, including white people, but they don't usually move out of that area. So when people from elsewhere come here, they'll go to one part of town and they'll go, yeah, wow, there's loads of mixed race people here, isn't there? And that's very much because of the history of the community and how it's developed over that long durée, over those 300 years of black settlement.
When I lived away from the world in Liverpool for a long time, and then I came back and I went to university in Birmingham. And through doing Muay Thai there, I was friends with the local security crew, and it was a mainly black crew. And that's who the students that I was working with. And I had, because I'd been away and I came back, that was the software I had for who I recognized as black. I came to Liverpool and it was off. Yeah. There's a guy called AJ who was a head doorman on Living Room when you used to go there. And he was telling a story one day, and the punchline of the story was, and the guy said, you know, that I was black. And I went, who's black? He went, me, you soft cunt. I was like, I didn't know you were black. He was laughing. He said, where do you think I was from? I was like, I don't know, Greek or maybe. Like, I don't, because I think for people who aren't from here don't realize, like you're saying, if you have mixed, and it goes through centuries, we just end up very handsome, as you can see. but some really good looking. I mean, some of the girls we have here. There's a comedian called Patrice O'Neill. I don't know if you know him. Oh, right. Amazing, one of my favourites of all time. And he used to come to Liverpool to do sets, and he loved the girls here because we do have like
wide and varied gene pool, old bean.
Wide and varied gene pool.
Yeah, well, we're a port city, aren't we? So that's something else that I'm very enamored by with the city, you know, is this long history of mixing, which I think is a real positive. And I think in a lot of ways, Liverpool is a harbinger for what other cities will look like, you know, with these governments that are cutting down more and more immigration here. Obviously, Brexit, you know, there's less opportunities for people to come here. So I think that the communities probably within certain demographics will probably become more mixed over time anyway, as part of that.
Yeah. A couple of questions, particularly about our relationship with America. We briefly mentioned when we were doing the walk. Again, it's partly history and it's partly cultural as well. When I went to Detroit, I was taken around the areas where the factories had been, and I saw the houses and the way that everything was constructed. It's overgrown and it's ruined, but it obviously was once very beautiful. I thought of Port Sunlight, and when I raised Detroit with you, you said that there were very strong similarities. Could you talk to that?
I mean, Detroit and Liverpool share some similarities in terms of our Great Decline. So we also, like Detroit, we rise very quickly. Again, obviously, America's history is different to Britain's, but these boom towns shoot up. Take advantage of economic opportunities. That's very much the story of Detroit around the motor industry. In Liverpool, it's trade with West Africa and the Caribbean, and then later the British Empire more generally. But once we start to dismantle that, and we dismantle our empire, Liverpool declines very rapidly. So we see equivalent types of population losses as Detroit sees when they start to dismantle their motor industry. And so that's probably the closest similarity. Obviously, we've got much different histories there, obviously. They've got a lake, whereas we've got the entire ocean.
Right.
But there's definitely some similarities in terms of the growth of the cities and how they both have gone into grand declines, which has left social deprivation, which is off the chart. And I still don't think Liverpool's come to terms with its decline yet.
Do you think we're still in a bit of abandonment anxiety
well,
over that?
Thankfully, we've got students who stay, haven't
Right,
we? Which is a mass. One of the legacies of Liverpool's involvement in slave trade is our great higher educational institution, something that they haven't come to terms with yet, but we're going to ensure that they do soon enough. And that's left a legacy, whereas people will come here because they know they get a quality education here, and many of those young people, because it is such a fine city, stay afterwards. So our population is slowly creeping up. I don't know if Detroit has got anything to kind of pull people back into the city. I know they're doing lots of guerrilla gardening in the gardens of these houses and stuff, and growing food and stuff. Yeah. But obviously, that was a megalith of a city at one stage.
It's insane. I think they took me to. I think I'm sorry if I get this wrong, Detroit. It's either a bus station or a train station that's disused now.
It was the train station, I think.
Train station.
Yeah, stunning, isn't it?
Stalin eat your heart out. This is a chunk of building, and it's confident and it's bold, and it's like, fuck you, I'm a fucking huge. And you look at it and you're like, wow. I mean, for the day, it's huge, and it's empty. And they're kicking around the idea of maybe knocking it down. And you just think, wow, really? There's nothing.
It's managed decline to the next level. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
We are objected to our managed decline when the Tories suggested it in the 80s. Yeah. In the only way that we could. My community, thankfully, was one of the people, was probably at the vanguard of kind of challenging that, along with people from other parts of the city. Yeah. But I don't know if Detroit has got, if it can, because it's so big. Do you know what I mean? It's lost such a massive amount of its population. If you think of the north of Liverpool, we pretty much did that. We dismantled the north of the city, sadly. But the south of the city where I grew up has kind of survived on the whole intact. Detroit still has a lot of soul searching to do and deciding on where it's going to go and what it's going to do with its fantastic buildings that are not being used currently.
It's such a I'd hate to see that. I mean, and these, I presume that it was similar concept to Port Sunlight. We need our factory workers. They're very valued. We want them to live in a community. We want it to, and it was it's idyllic. I thought because of what you hear of Detroit, I was like, oh, this is going to be, and it is in places. It's in a severe state of economic decline, but you can see what it was.
Absolutely.
So you have a big industry and it disappears very rapidly. The poorest elements of the population in Liverpool and Detroit can't leave. They're not mobile. You end up with criminality. Do you think our reputation in Liverpool for criminality is justified?
Well, we're a vibrant city. We're a city with links all over the world. So this all helps, particularly for the types of crime that we became known for in the 80s and 90s. And again, the history of the city would usually, well, I won't, like I say, we were a massive city. So whenever you get large populations of people congregating together, you get crime, you get organized crime. It's a byproduct of city life, isn't it? So whether or not it's justified, well, I'd say it's as justified as any other city. But obviously, when you go into decline and the legitimate economy declines, then people have to still eat. So they're going to
find the same number of mouths to feed, right?
Exactly. So you're going to find, you've got to find a way to provide that food by any means necessary. And for many of us, it meant crime. Yeah. Certainly for the ones who, as you say, couldn't move to pastures greener. So they got involved in the I won't say black economy after what we've all talked about today, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
And obviously, again, America is a very different country, but Detroit had that extra factor of crack, which never, I don't know, did it ever take off?
Did it hit here? It kind of, in Liverpool, it was, again, it hit my community pretty viciously. That's when really the gun crime started. Right. It was during the crack epidemic, which kind of hit here about 5 years after the States. So funnily enough, I was living in LA at the height of the crack epidemic when I was a kid, I lived there from when I was about 11 to about 13. And I lived in Inglewood.
Did you really?
Yeah, it was like a very interesting place to live during that time. And then when we got back here, Liverpool was totally in the doldrums.
Yeah.
And
what was Inglewood like for you when you were 11, 13 years old?
Bizarre, because I'd never witnessed a segregated community. You know the way the way people tell you those horror stories, black people when they go into a pub and everyone's white and they stop and look.
Yeah.
I did that to a white kid when he came into the liquor store where we used to play video games.
Yeah, and were you like, oh, what?
I was like, because growing up here, all my friends were of different backgrounds, and they'd stay in our house, and even to that day, so many of my friends are from that background, from a multitude of different backgrounds.
Yeah.
Inglewood was black. The only non-black people you saw were the Koreans who owned the off-light, where we used to go to the liquor store, we'd go and play the video games.
Yeah.
And this one day, this fat white kid comes in and my jaw dropped.
Yeah.
Absolutely dropped. And this is when people used to wear those Jerry curl caps. And I remember turning around, nudging, where's he from? And I'm a Scouser, do you know what I mean? This white kid comes in. I'd seen a white person for
you ain't from around here,
I'd seen
a
white kid. Do you know what I'm saying? I'd not seen a white kid since I'd left Liverpool.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that was like, I've remembered that for the rest of my life.
I've done the same thing in Malaysia, and it was to another white person because I hadn't seen one for 3 weeks, and I just went... and I was like, hang on, wait, you don't do that. Don't do that. That's not very nice, is it? Don't stare, darling.
I did it.
You did it.
I felt terrible as well afterwards. I was like, what the? And I was like, what are you doing, Laurence?
Was it? I mean, I accidentally, when I was 21, I drove into Long Beach, and then just recently, again, another accident in December, I ended up in Crenshaw. Crenshaw just recently when I drove, I just ran out of fuel. I was driving like anyway, I'd ran out of fuel, and Crenshaw was just like a nice suburban neighborhood. I was like, because I watched the films when I was a kid, Boys in the Hood.
Well, I lived right on Crenshaw, but the Inglewood end. So,
okay.
Because it's a really long boulevard, isn't it?
Yeah. Was it bad? Was it rough?
It was really bad. And we had friends who lived in Compton. So the last few weeks before we moved back, we lived there, and it was...
Was that rough?
This was like when like Colours was out, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so,
Colours.
do you remember that film?
Yeah.
And it was really like that, do you know what I mean? I was like, oh shit. Like guns would be you hear the guns going off all the time. So this is at the height of crack and the gangs and stuff.
Yeah.
Now Inglewood is becoming gentrified. This is when Staples wasn't there. This is when the downtown was like Skid Row and the garment district. Nothing went on downtown. That was like at night. It was like something out the Warriors.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean? But thankfully, I was only a kid.
Warriors and colours. We're going back in time here, kids.
I'm telling you. But that was very much like how I experienced LA. My first experience with the States was that.
Yeah,
and when I came back here. Crack had hit in the same way, and some of those people who'd been at the forefront and in the vanguard of the struggle, for in the black community during the 70s and 80s, they were selling that stuff.
Really,
and again that shows like in one generation how the Orwellian thing about you start off with noble, motivations, and then you end up becoming just part of this what you despised. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean it's such a stupid trite point to make, but I'm going to make it anyway. When I went to Long Beach when I was 21, it was a pawn shop, liquor store, chicken, gun, porn store, and I was like, well, what else? There's nothing here but like a means to get fucked up, and there wasn't. Everybody has an individual responsibility for sure, but we know from psychology that environments shape personalities and behaviors, and you've got to. I mean, I don't want to get too far into politics, but you've got to meet people somewhere in the middle, I think.
Well, I think I want to see a meritocracy.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I want to see people having a basic standard where they can grow.
Yeah.
Not where they're stunted. Yeah. You know what I mean? And that takes effort, conscious effort to kind of address some of the issues that you associate with socialization. Do you know what I mean? And if you've grown up in communities where all you see is the things that you said, then chances are you're going to engage in that. And then you're going to...
Under what circumstances would you not?
Exactly.
Would be the question I would have. Why would you... You'd have to be a total aberration to be like...
Total anomaly. Deviant.
A deviant.
A deviant. That's what you'd have to be.
Yeah.
And when you think to yourself, in this country, it costs more to send a kid to jail than it does to send them to Eton. That gives you another perspective on things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What do you value You know, do you want to live in a society that works for everyone, or do you just want to punish people when they go wrong, when all the odds are stacked against them anyway?
And then use them as slave labor via the back door.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Or just now in these post-industrial societies like ours, they're not even that, are they? They no longer have a function. Do you know what I mean? Their only function is to cause, problems within your society, because we're living in this draconian society where capitalism, unbridled capitalism just seems to be the order of the day. And even though it costs more, like I say, to the public purse to send a kid to reform school, if that's what you want to call it, Borstal or whatever you call it now, than it does to send them to Eton. Rather do that. That's better than giving everybody an education where they can then challenge my child's position. There can only be so many stockbrokers, can't they? If everyone goes to Eton, then
there does seem to be a mentality, really, of a zero-sum game.
Of course,
where we're like, we're capitalists, but we don't believe there's enough for everybody. And I'm like, I'm not sure that you're really. That's some alternative vision there. There is certainly not an endeavor to create a nation of philosopher kings and philosopher queens.
There you go. Or even people who can contribute to society in a positive way, even if it is just in the free market. You really want it to be tied up for you.
Yeah,
you want every opportunity to go for you, but and then if people go wrong, you want to punish them, but not give them an opportunity to raise their position. And as now we're getting really dystopian, but as mechanization starts to take away the jobs of the so-called working class, but we continue to provide them only with that culture that we associate with working class, the pub, the offie, the bookies, what's going to happen?
Well, we'll all become Detroit. We'll all become Liverpool.
But I mean, it might just become a case of eat the rich, innit? Because at the end of the day, unless you can afford to provide for all these people who no longer have jobs in the ASDA, because now it's all self-service. Do you know what I mean? Or
what do you think of those self-service machines?
I hate them.
I want to bat them.
Yeah, totally. I hate them.
I'm from a different generation. They make me violently angry.
They've accounted, right? They've accounted, said, we know more people shoplift now, but the losses to shoplifting is still less than what we cost us to pay someone.
Pure equation, isn't it?
Pure.
Whenever they break and they come over and they're like, what can I do for you? I'm always like, I don't work here. Let's just be clear. I don't actually get paid to be here wrestling with the barcode of my mixed vegetables.
Dude, I went into the post office in Liverpool 1 now. That's mainly self-serve. My God, I've never had such a terrible experience in my life. It is hideous. Absolutely hideous.
So, well, as you rightly say, with that kind of automation and mechanization, we do have to ask the question, what kind of a road are we on? And I think this is, I'm not a Marxist, but Marx was talking about a spontaneous communism, right? Originally, we may very well be setting up the conditions for that right now because, well, just the disparity and the unfairness, especially post-pandemic. Once it becomes truly unbearable and people get really desperate, there's going to be problems.
Yeah, or if they turn the telly off. I think that would be enough. Do you know what I mean? I
agree 100%.
I think if once people have to start engaging with other people and talking about things, especially if you stop the sport as well, particularly men, because for me that's like a massive issue, is the way like men's natural proclivity to kind of discuss and debate issues that matter has kind of been diverted to sport and these things that have no real relevance in how we live our lives, in society whatsoever. I think that's one of the reasons why the decline of the trade unions, the cooperative movements, I think it's all down to a lot of people being distracted by things like, 11 men running around the football pitch, because we want to organize, we as human beings, we're social creatures, we want to organize. And people are organizing around the footy instead of organising around the communities. Women, I'd say a lot of women, I don't mean to sound sexist, but I think a lot of women are more interested in what's going on Coronation Street than what's going on their own street. So they'll get more engaged in the lives and machinations of fictional characters than they will about what's going on in the next door neighbours, or the idea of, it takes a village to raise a child. So when you're all living in Terrace Street, I'll keep an eye on your kids. And you keep an eye on mine when I can't. Oh, you need some eggs, sound? No, you're not getting paid until the end of the week. That's kind of disappearing. Those cultures that supported working class communities. Because they didn't have the resources that people who were a little bit more affluent had. So I think that's like the opium of the masses. The opium of the masses in many ways is these things that really have no bearing on the way we live our lives and the importance of our lives, and yet we invest so much into them in terms of our man and woman hours. Do you know what I mean? It's bizarre.
It's interesting. You just made me think then, which is not easy to do. It used to be the case, didn't it, that to be isolated and in your own home, you had to be quite rich, and now everybody can afford that, and we lose all the benefits of the tribal contact. Like you say, just a simple thing like looking after each other's kids, even if it's only 15, 20 minutes, social cohesion, being involved with each other, probably nosy and irritating and all the rest of it as well. But you also had trade unions, social movements that were self-interested. Now, as you say, it's just gone.
And now people are complaining about loneliness and isolation.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
People who want to shove their heads in their phones and watch Netflix all day are complaining that they're fucking lonely.
And as you said, the pandemic just kind of heightened all that, didn't it? When you when you had the choice, you could give yourself the illusion. You can say, well, I can do it if I want to.
Yeah.
And then as soon as you couldn't do it,
yes,
you started to be a little more introspective, going, God, don't like this.
Well,
there's the idea of the extended family, which was of such importance to people, not just 1-2 generations ago. You know, that seems to have been whittled away as well. So now, once someone's old, they're no longer like someone to be respected. Just get them in the knackies yard. Just get them in the home.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I hope I never do that to my mother. I'm saying this now on camera.
Yeah.
I hope I never do that. Do you know what I mean? But that's how it's become. It's like that idea that these have no value anymore.
Yeah.
They don't produce. You know, they just sat at home all day. They have to be cared for like a baby. So stick them in the knacker's yard, because we don't have those extended families that support people. You know, when a parent is getting older, if you've got 5 kids, everyone can chip in. Do you know what I mean? But it's left on the one child to do it. Then obviously it's going to become a burden, and that's a sad thing for me about, I think, the way our society has gone.
Well, it is sad, and maybe it will bring us to a crisis point where we do go back to authentic life, and we just come back to each other and go, you know what, those machines and these TVs and the smartphones, that was shit. This is what it's really about. I actually feel good. I mean, you get your brain is stimulated. You sort of, I don't know, after I find these talks cathartic, get something out, you learn something, you see the world a different way, and you go, that was worth it. Sitting on your phone all day, no wonder people are depressed and anxious. You're not really growing. You're just stuck in an echo chamber, aren't you?
Humans have evolved as social creatures. So much of the way we live our lives traditionally was about social interaction. You know, even our festivals, religious festivals, get together. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like, I go and play my presents by myself.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It was an opportunity for people to get together, and that's all been lost in the digital age. Whether it'll continue on that way, whether there'll be a rejection of it, I don't know. Maybe it'll take some type of cataclysmic event to kind of get people to really value human interaction again. But that's, for me, is one of the great losses. Things like the working men's clubs. Do you know what I mean? Places where you could go, community centres, youth clubs. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. These were I do remember the Atari. I'm not that old. Do you know what I mean? I would always choose to go and play footy with the lads in the Unity and sit on my computer. Do you know what I mean? If there was an opportunity to interact, but now that's because you can do so much interaction in the home on those games. A lot of kids don't ever see each other, and they're just getting fat and, out of shape before they've even grown to full maturity.
A question that's off the general topic, but I know, as a parent, you must be in more contact with other parents, whether you like it or not. You must be speaking with other parents. Do you see parents encouraging their kids moving away from playing football outside to being inside that? Do you see any of that going on?
I definitely think there's a fear of the outdoors now.
Yeah.
Like the idea of kids going out and you not knowing where your kid is.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That's shocking to so many people. Oh my God.
Yeah.
And we all grew up like that. Yeah. That's not that long ago. Come on.
No. Do
you know what I mean? So kids being out unsupervised, that's like something, okay, there might be more cars on the road, but come on. Do you know what I mean? We're talking about the 1990s, 1980s, but that seems to have become like the dominant discourse. Kids can only be out with adult supervision.
Yeah. Yeah. Which it doesn't make for much autonomy and resilience, does it?
But even like learning how to be an adult, learning how to not rely on other people and being self-reliant, or learning how to relate to other people who are of your same peer group. Do you know what I mean? Same age. That's all being lost.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And I don't want to go on about things like, you know.
No, I think in many ways it's pertinent to the conversation because, you know, as we started out at the beginning of the first interview, history can repeat itself, and we shouldn't assume that it just spirals up and gets better and better. There isn't really much evidence of that. I think we are a little bit too in love with our tech, and we think, because technological advancement is happening, we might just have better genocides or better, more effective genocides, more effective slavery in the future.
Well, it's all relative, and like I said in the the Whiggish view of history that things are always getting better. Progress is the norm. That's demonstrated quite clearly by just looking at the 20th century, the people's century, when we wiped out more people with our tech, with our high tech, with our planes that then became jet planes. You know, than any other century beforehand, and yet we were so learned, we were so advanced, long post Enlightenment. We understood that humans are equals, and yet we still could go out and commit genocides based on race and ethnicity, etc. So, I'm totally of the opinion that this can happen again. And as Orwell and others, it's about constant vigilance. It's about not trusting the human to do what's best just because they've been told what is the best thing to do. Because we can go back, to animal brain. Like that, Lord of the Flies style or whatever, and that for me is what is most important. And the way I contribute to that is by talking about this history.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Trying to contextualize things within that framework to help us to understand why we live the way that we live, and we have these structures, and we're still struggling with today.
And I think it's just to follow that point, it's important to have the humility to recognize we're not better or worse than the people in our history. We just haven't evolved that much yet.
The human condition doesn't change.
No.
That's one of the things I think like that theology kind of teaches us. Do you know what I mean? No matter how many new ideas we think up, human condition, you're still a human. You've evolved to be like this. If you want to control your lizard brain, you have to actively control your lizard brain. It's easier the more information you've got, but it still takes a discipline. Do you know what I mean? It's very easy to go back. Like seeing Rwanda or like the Balkans, as you said, people who were neighbours, man. People who broke bread with each other. Do you know what I mean? And then snap. And there you are slaughtering each other in the street. That's in the 1990s.
It's not. I mean, we're talking.
It's yesterday. It's not even yesterday.
It's very, very recent, isn't it? Yeah. There's the So when we're talking about parenting and communities and all the rest of it, I don't know. My strong sense is I don't want people to devolve into a utopian version of the world. I want to be more historically literate. I mean, I've learned so much talking to you, and I don't even. It's not like revolutionize my politics or anything. I just think there's so much. Like I think Jamaica, and I have a little picture in my mind of what Jamaica is. Bang, there's the Dominican Republic right there. I just go, lad, you're not even on level 1 of that story. Just open that box and you go, fucking hell. There you go. Should we know that? Yeah. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's nasty, you should know it so that you can make informed choices, I think.
From the British perspective, and I suppose this could be applied to the American perspective as well, I think it's really important to understand how those places made this country the way that it is in terms of its wealth. You know, you can't really think about Britain in the 19th century without thinking about the toil of enslaved people, because all that wealth that was coming in was because we were extracting it from elsewhere. I use that kind of trope when I take a lot of lads around who are in danger of getting into trouble from London. They come up to Liverpool and I always say to them, listen, you might only be the first generation born here, but your parents came from the Caribbean. And although they might not have been in England, they contributed as much to England's development as a cotton weaver in a mill in Manchester or any other group of people. You were still subjects of the British, or your parents or ancestors were still subjects of the British Crown. You just didn't get any of the benefits of that. So don't let anybody tell you that you don't belong here because your parents may have immigrated from a former British colony, because those colonies provided so much wealth that went into building up this country. I think that's really an important thing to tell people, to give them that sense of belonging in context with this much wider history.
There you go.
Britain, if you look at us in terms of our natural resources, we're not very, we don't have much. Bit of coal and a bit of tin, but we became the fifth largest. We've become the fifth largest economy
through psychopathy and entrepreneurialism.
I couldn't say it any better than
Our
that.
greatest exports.
Totally.
What?
Well, that's it, isn't it?
There's a place over there that hasn't been done in yet.
Well, that's what it was.
Get the flag, Harold.
That's what it was. And carving up countries, you know, yes, this red line. Okay, you can have that side and we'll have this side.
Yeah.
And, you
know. It's funny, like it always interests me, the American movies, the Star Wars movies, and they had these obviously Nazi dark side guys portrayed by English actors with a proper English accent. And I was like, God, yeah, because there is a kind of a dark force mind control at work there. When we went in and divided up a country that had never been divided before, why didn't people just say, it's almost like we imposed our logic. And they went, yeah, okay, no, yeah, that makes
perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense.
Forget about the people and whether or not we've gone through the sense of a tribal homeland, you know, and split two groups of different people, making them a minority in this country and a majority in the other.
Yeah.
None of that ever came into anyone's minds, and yet all those countries have kept those colonial borders.
Yeah.
And you see why so many of them are at war with each other.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Because they become minorities in countries where they were once the majority. Well, in places where they were once the majority, and it's got all kinds of knock-on effects. But we didn't think about that when we were drawing straight lines through maps.
No, it was nice and straight.
Yes.
That's why we put it there. It was nice and straight.
Yes, we like order.
It's interesting. Just the final point. Like at the moment, you've got Israel, Palestine, the situation as it is, and the historical illiteracy. We could do a whole interview just about that. Nobody mentions the Brits.
No, I know.
They're just like, I'm on this side. I'm on this side. Oh, this is terrible. Look at what they. And I'm sat back going, we just get away with this.
We get away with it, don't we? All over the world we do, because of that lack of historical literacy.
Right.
Because people don't look at things within the context, do they?
Yeah.
You know, they just see what's happened. They watch the news, and that's as far as go. What happened yesterday? Oh, that's terrible, innit? That you know, they don't think about what went on 1970 before Balfour's Declaration. They don't think about these things and the events and acts that took place during that period that have kind of shaped that part of the world today. So we've got a great role to play.
A good mate of mine said of the Israel-Palestine, he's from LA himself. He's 30s millennial, and he said what people don't realize is this has been going on for at least 20 years. I was like,
oh wow.
It's not 20 years.
Oh, wow.
we can't even really say, like, it's so long. And there are, you know, like you say, the silly narratives of like who was there and what tribe was there and what race is there. And I'm like, are you aware that there was always a Jewish presence there? There was these people fought together against the Christians in the Crusades. And then, you know,
Ben Gurion said that the Jews never left. They just became Muslims. So, you know, there's so much more there. There's so much nuance. The big problem is this desire for nationhood. That's the issue. Right. Nationalism is the real issue. Yeah. It's when people get these ideas of statehood and nation state that you then have to start creating these others. Yes. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, so we need an army because we're a nation and we need to be in the majority. So we've got to get rid of some of them. And that's kind of where a lot of these problems, not just in terms of what's gone on in Israel, Palestine, but all over the world, it's these creation, you know, a nation falls and then a new nation springs up with their own ideologies. And that creates all kinds of issues. That's another, you know, there's a psychopathy associated with nationalism, you know, and the need to create a national story, which puts certain people who may geographically be located there since year dot outside of that story. And obviously that's happened to the Jews in so many places. You know. But for me, that's kind of like one of the issues that humans haven't really got their head around and haven't really consulted history.
Yes.
And kind of said, well, we're going to do things a bit different because we've seen how this has gone wrong so many times in the past. You know, we're just talking about the Balkans, you know, this idea of what the Ottomans put together was torn asunder. Yeah. And that terrible brutality that happened there. Same with Rwanda, with the French, you know, so you've got all those issues. And until we can kind of stop thinking about these things like we think support our favourite football team, then nothing's ever going to change.
100%. It's a team mentality, isn't it? Yeah. And as you were talking then, I was just thinking, if I have a nation, I have a team, but that nation only exists, you can only see it and feel it in opposition. I have to have enemies then.
Got to have it.
Otherwise, what does it mean? I have a nation, I'm a team, and I don't play anyone. well, that's a bit shit.
That's why so many of the ones that are ultra nationalists build up these big armies, and you some of your identity comes from fighting against those others that you've already said are not part of our nation.
Yeah.
It's all heavy stuff, but very interesting nonetheless.
Well, listen, we're the men to deconstruct it, Laurence. I've decided it should be done here in Liverpool by me and you. We'll fix it all. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you again, mate. Thanks so much.
Thank you for
coming in. And I hope
always
we can
my
do
pleasure.
this again.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
Either here or in Ibiza. Are you coming to Ibiza to do the editing? Yeah. We'll go over there and do it.
And if you ever want to do a filmed walk or anything like that,
yeah,
I'd be happy to do something like that. I think, again, because you've got a lot of people from outside, like you've got the States, you can really focus on all these American links. So we talk about Robert Morris, for example.
Well, you can't escape the American links here, can you?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
We'll do that. We'll film a walk and we'll really place Liverpool as that 51st state.
Definitely.
Like the film said. There's the other project you have going with the GoFundMe. If you could explain that into your camera.
Yeah, so we're raising money for a slavery memorial here in Liverpool. Again, Liverpool was the centre of the slave trade, but yet we don't have any memorials here really highlighting this history. So we've set up a GoFundMe page, which you'll be able to find on a link beneath this video.
Awesome.
Also, you can join my Facebook group as well, which is called Liverpool in Slavery. I put lots of interesting information up there about Liverpool's historic links to slavery and the slave trade.
And that's updated pretty much daily, isn't it? There's loads of good stuff there. So all the links to that are down below. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. If you've got any questions or comments, put them in the box below. And hopefully we'll be doing this again very soon. Thank you.